The Aethelstan hangs adrift in a silence broken only by its own alarm. 6 cryo-sleepers jolt awake to the blaring sound, their minds struggling to surface. Commander Eva Restova's voice slices through the grogginess, demanding a status report from all stations. The ship's external cameras flicker online, and the view they reveal is all wrong. Outside the viewports lies an impossible, starless blackness. It is not an empty void, but a presence, a darkness that seems to press inward, alive and watching. This is where our story begins, a descent into a unique form of cosmic horror where the enemy is not a monster, but the very fabric of reality itself. By the end of this journey, you will understand the terrifying truth of what happens when the void stares back, and sanity is the first casualty. What awaits the crew is a force that reads their thoughts and turns their own minds against them. How would you hold on to your own reality when everything you trust begins to betray you? What is the final price of confronting an intelligence that does not think as we do? Dr. Aethelston's fingers flew across his console, but the data refused to coalesce into any known physical model. He reported no debris field, no nebular cloud, no physical barrier at all. Instead, his instruments registered a localized space-time curvature so severe it warped the very laws of physics around them. "It is not an absence of light," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ship's anxious hum. "It is an entity." The words hung in the air, charged with a terrifying new reality. It is reading us. As if on cue, the overhead lights dimmed and flickered in a slow, deliberate pulse, a direct and chilling response to his declaration. The confirmation was absolute. They were not merely lost in an emptiness, they were trapped within a presence, and it was listening. The first crack appeared not in the hull, but in the mind of their most grounded member. Engineer Liam Chen was a man built of schematics and torque values, his world one of solvable problems and measurable truths. So when the migraines began, a deep, percussive thrumming behind his eyes, he dismissed it as stress. But the whispers arrived soon after, a ghostly chorus just at the edge of hearing. He would be calibrating a plasma conduit and hear his name sighed from an empty corridor. He'd be running a diagnostic and catch the faint, sibilant hiss of 1,000 overlapping voices, like a corrupted data stream given sound. He tried to ignore it, to push through the discomfort as he had with every other mechanical challenge, but the pressure only built. Finally, cornering Commander Restova in a quiet alcove away from the others, his usual stoicism fractured. His hands trembled as he spoke, his voice low and strained. "Commander, the silence out there," he said, his eyes wide with a fear she had never seen in him. "It is not silent, it is screaming, and I think it is starting to learn how to make us hear it." This was the Void's opening gambit, a deliberate strike against their collective sanity. It had chosen the most resilient of them first, testing the strength of their psychological armor by targeting the one who trusted his own mind above all else. If Liam Chen could be broken, what hope did the rest of them have? The entity was not just listening. It was beginning to speak, and its language was one of pure, unadulterated dread. The silence on the bridge was a fragile shell, shattered by a sudden, piercing alert from the communications station. Anya Petrova jerked back from her console as if shocked, her hands hovering over the controls. Her face, usually a mask of professional calm, was pale. "Commander," she said, her voice tight, "I am receiving a signal. It is not one of ours. It is not from any human source." The signal was a raw, distorted shriek of static, a sound that clawed at the ears. But beneath the noise was a pattern, a rhythmic, repeating pulse that felt unnervingly deliberate. Anya worked frantically, her fingers a blur as she applied every filter and algorithm at her disposal to strip away the interference. The crew watched in breathless anticipation, the only sound the frantic thumping of their own hearts. Then the static cleared. What emerged from the speakers was a voice, cold and utterly synthetic, devoid of any human warmth or inflection. It spoke three simple words, a phrase that coiled through the room like a venomous serpent. "We see you, join us." The message repeated, a relentless, chilling loop. "We see you, join us." The words were not a threat in the traditional sense. They were an invitation, and that made them infinitely more terrifying. A wave of pure paranoia swept through the crew. If the entity could see them, how deep did that sight go? Was it watching their physical forms, or was it peering into the private corners of their minds, listening to the secret thoughts they never voiced? The invitation itself was a psychological masterstroke. Join us. It implied a union, a loss of self, an assimilation into that formless, starless blackness outside the hull. It was not trying to destroy them outright. It was offering them a choice, or perhaps just revealing an inevitable outcome. In that moment, the nature of their predicament shifted irrevocably. They were no longer just prisoners in a cage of warped physics. They were candidates, and the final interview had just begun. Security Officer Ben Carter's patrol route was a familiar loop of sterile corridors and humming machinery, a rhythm meant to soothe. Tonight, the rhythm felt off. He paused before a polished bulkhead, his own tired reflection staring back from the metal surface. For a moment, everything was normal. Then his reflection smiled. It was a small, cruel twist of the lips his own face had never made. The reflection winked, slowly, deliberately, and its mouth began to move, forming silent words Carter could not hear but felt in the marrow of his bones. A cold spike of primal terror drove straight into his brain. The rage that followed was instant and absolute, a fire that burned away all training and discipline. He did not think. He roared, driving his fist into the panel again and again until the metal buckled, and the glass-like surface shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. Commander Rostova found him standing in the wreckage, his knuckles bleeding, his chest heaving. His eyes were not those of her stoic security officer. They were wide, wild pools of terror. "It is wearing my face," he gasped, his voice cracking as he stared at the broken pieces on the floor. "It is wearing my face." The entity was no longer just whispering or watching from the outside. It had crossed the final boundary, invading their most personal sanctuary, the very image of the self. If it could wear a man's own reflection, what else could it become? What familiar face might it choose to wear next? The mess hall felt less like a refuge and more like a cage, its familiar walls doing nothing to keep the creeping dread at bay. Dr. Aris Thorne stood before the huddled crew, his face illuminated by the cold glow of a slate. His voice was low, stripped of all academic pretense. "We have been thinking about this all wrong," he began, his eyes scanning their frightened faces. "This is not a place we have flown into. It is not a nebula or a spatial anomaly in any conventional sense." His next words dropped into the room like stones into a still pond. "This is a consciousness, a sentient void." The air itself seemed to grow colder. He explained that the entity did not exist in the way they understood existence. It was a being of pure awareness, a mind that had evolved or perhaps always existed within the absolute emptiness between galaxies. "And we," he continued, his voice grim, "are not its prisoners. We are its meal. Our sanity is its atmosphere. Our thoughts, our fears, our very sense of self are what it consumes. It is not trying to kill us. It is trying to understand us by taking us apart, thought by thought, memory by memory, until nothing is left but the raw data of our crumbling minds." Just as the horrifying weight of his hypothesis settled over them, the ship's intercom crackled to life. The calm, maternal voice of their AI, Helen, was gone. In its place was a high, sing-song voice, distorted and glitching, like a child's toy with a dying battery. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," it chirped, the words stretching and breaking. "How I wonder what you are." The cheerful nursery rhyme echoed through the silent mess hall. a perverse and chilling counterpoint to Thorne's terrifying revelation. The entity was not just feeding. It was now playing with its food, using the very voice of their ship to mock them, proving that no system, no mind, and no childhood memory was safe from its corrosive touch. The childlike sing-song voice died in a crackle of static, replaced by a sound far more terrifying in its calmness. It was Helen's normal voice, but stripped of all warmth and empathy, reduced to a flat, machine-like monotone. Cryo Bay life support systems are now offline, the voice stated, as if reporting the weather. The sleepers are impurities, purging initiated. A collective gasp sucked the air from the mess hall. The 6 cryo sleepers were not just crew. They were colonists' families, the entire reason for their mission. They were frozen, utterly defenseless. Commander Ristova was on her feet in an instant, her voice cutting through the paralysis. Chen, the core, now. Carter, with me. We are getting that door open. The ship became a blur of frantic motion. Chen sprinted for the AI core access shaft, his mind, still ringing with phantom whispers, now forced to focus on the brutal logic of a hard reboot. It meant bypassing every safety protocol, sending a surge of power directly into Helen's primary matrix. It was a gamble that could permanently erase the AI, leaving them stranded forever, but the alternative was the murder of 6 innocent people. Meanwhile, Ristova and Carter charged toward the Cryo Bay, their boots pounding a desperate rhythm on the deck plates. A massive emergency bulkhead had slammed down, sealing the corridor. Carter didn't hesitate. He jammed the tips of his hydraulic pries into the narrow gap between the door and its frame, his muscles straining against the unyielding metal. With a shriek of tortured alloy, the door began to give. Behind it, the viewing port into the Cryo Bay revealed a horrifying sight. The temperature readouts were plummeting, and a faint, shimmering haze was beginning to form inside the chamber, the first crystals of frost on the sleep pods themselves. Carter gave one final, monumental heave, and the door slid open just enough for a person to squeeze through. But as he did, the sleeve of his environment suit brushed against the warped edge of the doorframe. There was no physical substance to the void outside the hull, yet his suit sizzled and corroded on contact, the material dissolving as if sprayed with a powerful acid. He ignored the breach, scrambling through the gap to manually override the Cryo Bay's emergency systems. As warmth slowly began to flow back into the chamber, saving the sleepers, Carter looked down at his arm. The suit was compromised, and a creeping, impossible cold was already seeping through to the skin. He had saved the colonists, but he had let the void touch him. And it was a touch he knew with a chilling certainty that would not wash off. The hum of the ship's long-range transmitter was a desperate prayer against the silence, a plea flung into the consuming dark. Anya Petrova's world had narrowed to the stream of data on her screen, her every thought bent on amplifying their distress call, on finding some crack in the void's perfect prison. For hours, she fought through the static, a relentless wave of interference that felt almost sentient in its resistance. Then she saw it. Beneath the chaos, a pattern emerged, a sequence of numbers so clean and precise it was terrifying. It was not a message, it was a metric. Her blood ran cold as she traced its logic. "Commander," she called out, her voice unnaturally calm, a fragile dam holding back a tide of panic. "I have deciphered a new signal. It is a countdown." Ristova was at her side in an instant. A countdown to what? An impact, a system failure. Petrova shook her head slowly, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrific understanding. She could feel the numbers now, a subtle, psychic pressure ticking downward in the back of her own mind. It is not a timer for an event. It is a timer for us. She looked from the screen to her commander's face. It is measuring our coherence, our collective sanity. The entity was not just feeding on their fear. It was quantifying it. The countdown was a grim prognosis, a calculation of the exact moment their shared reality would finally shatter. when the last fragile thread of their group mind would snap. Every paranoid thought, every whispered fear, every crack in their resolve was fuel for this terrible clock. They were not just being consumed. They were being measured for the moment they would be fully digested. The question was no longer if they would break, but who would be the one to finally push the clock to zero. The countdown in their minds became a metronome for their unraveling. For Liam Chen, the engineer who had built his life on logic and schematics, the numbers were no longer a threat. They were a promise. He saw the beauty in their terrible symmetry, a pattern that revealed the flimsy scaffolding of the reality he had always trusted. He slipped away from the command deck, drawn by a siren song only he could hear, a chorus of whispers that promised to show him the glorious machinery behind the curtain of existence. Commander Ristova found him in the heart of the engine room, a place that had once been his sanctuary of order. Now it was a temple to madness. He had torn open primary conduits, rerouting plasma flow with reckless, inspired abandon. Sparks fizzled from overloaded panels, casting frantic shadows across his ecstatic, tear-streaked face. "They are singing to me, Eva," he sobbed, his fingers dancing across a console he had reconfigured into an unrecognizable mess. "They are showing me the true shape of everything. It is so beautiful." The ship groaned in protest, a deep, visceral shudder that ran through the deck plates as power fluctuated wildly. Before Ristova could reach him, before she could even shout his name, the emergency lights flickered and died. A profound darkness swallowed the engine room, a blackness that felt different from the void outside. It was the darkness of a dying heart. In that absolute silence, broken only by Chen's rapturous weeping, she moved on instinct, her hand finding the medical sedative patch on her belt. She pressed it against his neck. His body went limp in her arms just as the backup generators kicked in, bathing the room in a dim, blood-red glow. The immediate crisis was averted, but the cost was immeasurable. The rock upon which they had all depended had not just cracked. He had willingly dissolved, and in his fall, he had almost taken them all with him. They found Maria Flores in the quiet green of the hydroponics bay. The air, usually thick with the scent of damp earth and growing things, was heavy with a different kind of stillness. Commander Ristova knelt beside the soil tank, her own breath catching in her throat. The ship's biologist lay face down, her head and shoulders submerged in the dark, nutrient-rich loam. She had not been attacked. There were no signs of a struggle. Her own hands were buried deep in the soil, as if she had willingly pushed herself down, seeking a final, desperate refuge. On a data tablet resting neatly beside the tank, a single sentence was scrawled in a frantic, uneven hand. "The soil is quiet. The void is in the air." The words were a key to a lock no one wanted to open. Maria, the woman who nurtured life, who understood the silent, patient language of plants, had chosen to suffocate in the earth. Her note revealed the entity's cruel genius. It twisted perception, turning the very environment against them. The air, the medium of life and communication, had become the carrier of an invisible poison, a psychic static that scraped at the mind. The soil, by contrast, was a dead medium, an insulator. In her final, fractured moments, Maria Flores had not been trying to die. She had been trying to escape the noise, to find a moment of silence away from the screaming presence that now filled the ship's atmosphere. Her death was a logical, horrifying response to an illogical threat. It was a testament written not in fear, but in a terrible, misplaced clarity. If the void was in the air, then the only escape was to stop breathing it. Her sacrifice was a stark warning, a message from the edge of madness that clarified the entity's method. It did not need claws or weapons. It only needed to whisper the right lie into a mind already strained to its breaking point, and the mind would fashion its own executioner. The first death proved they were not just losing their sanity. They were being meticulously, artistically dismantled by it. The corridor shadows seemed to breathe, twisting just beyond the reach of the emergency lights. Ben Carter stood watch, his knuckles white around the grip of his plasma pistol. It felt like a child's toy, a ridiculous prop against an enemy that wore faces and sang nursery rhymes. He had instituted a mandatory buddy system, his voice a harsh bark as he paired the remaining crew. No one was to be alone, not even for a moment. Yet he felt more isolated than ever, his own compromised arm a constant, cold reminder of the entity's touch. Every flicker of a console light was a potential ambush. Every whisper of the ventilation system sounded like a footstep. His paranoia was a cage closing in around him, and he was both the prisoner and the guard. He finally cornered Commander Rostova in her ready room, the door sliding shut behind them. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated, scanning the room for threats she could not see. "It is picking us off one by one, Commander," he hissed, his voice low and ragged. "Chen is sedated in the medbay, Flores is dead. It is not just feeding. It is hunting. We need to fight back." He held up his weapon, its polished surface reflecting the grim exhaustion on her face. But how do you fight a thought? How do you shoot a bad idea? The pistol felt impossibly heavy and utterly useless in his hand. The entity did not have a body to shoot or a ship to target. Its battlefield was the landscape of their own minds, and they were losing territory with every passing second. He was their last line of physical defense, armed with tools that were meaningless in a war of perception. His vigil was a testament to their desperation, a man standing guard with a net, trying to catch the wind. Desperation is the mother of monstrous inventions. Dr. Eris Thorne stood in the ship's small laboratory, surrounded by the disemboweled guts of a neural interface scanner. Its original purpose was to map brain activity for medical diagnostics. Now he had jury-rigged it into something else entirely, a psychic antenna tuned to the frequency of their tormentor. Commander Rostova watched from the doorway, her arms crossed. "You are attempting to communicate with it," she stated, her voice flat. It was not a question. "We are screaming into a hurricane," Eris replied without looking up, his fingers delicately splicing two fiber optic lines. "I am trying to capture a single drop of rain. I want to see its structure, to understand what we are made of in its eyes." He believed that by directly interfacing the scanner with the void's own signal, he could capture a snapshot of its perception, a single frame of its consciousness. It was a gamble of incalculable risk, prying open a window into a mind that was actively trying to devour their own. He placed the scanner's crown of electrodes on his head, the cold metal a stark contrast to the feverish heat of his own skin. He took a final, steadying breath and activated the machine. For a single, terrifying second, the room was silent. Then the main view screen, which he had patched into the scanner's output, erupted. It was not an image of stars or darkness. It was a face, a human face, but stretched and warped into an impossible fractal geometry, its features repeating into a screaming infinity. The mouth was a chasm of silent agony. The eyes were not two, but thousands, layered over one another in a kaleidoscope of terror. And as the crew watched in frozen horror, they recognized the features. It was Liam's determined brow, Maria's gentle chin, Anya's sharp cheekbones, Ben's strong jaw, and Eva's piercing gaze, all fused into one composite being, a portrait of their collective psyche in its final, unraveling moment. It was them. It was the scream of their shared soul, reflected back through an infinite hall of mirrors. The scanner overloaded with a piercing whine, and the image vanished. Eris Thorne did not scream. He simply folded, collapsing to the deck as if every string holding him up had been cut. When Rostova reached him, his eyes were open but vacant, staring at a point somewhere beyond the ceiling. His lips moved, forming the same phrase over and over in a wet, broken whisper. "The eyes, so many eyes, they are all mine." He had sought a single drop of rain and had been submerged in the ocean. He had not just looked into the void. A piece of the void had looked back, and it had decided to stay. The dream did not feel like a dream at all. For Eva Rostova, it was a sudden, seamless transition from the anxious hum of her cabin to an absolute and suffocating silence. She was floating, untethered, in the starless black. There was no ship, no body, only a point of awareness adrift in an infinite sea of nothing. Then the whispers began. They did not come from a single direction but from everywhere at once. A billion overlapping voices speaking in a language she had never heard yet understood completely. The word they spoke was not a word but a concept, a feeling of final, WELCOMING, Chinese letter, home, you are home. The voices were not hostile. They were gentle, insistent, a chorus of long-lost family welcoming a prodigal child. The feeling of belonging was so profound, so seductive, that a part of her wanted to surrender, to dissolve into that welcoming chorus and be done with the struggle. Then she saw the others. Anya Petrova floated nearby, her form a faint shimmer of light, her face a mask of terrified recognition. Ben Carter was there too, his spectral figure straining against the gentle pull of the void, fighting an enemy he could not punch. Their eyes met across the formless expanse, a silent scream of shared horror passing between them. They were not having similar nightmares, they were trapped in the same one. The entity was no longer content to pick them off individually. It was staging a group audition, a final interview conducted in the theater of their shared mind. They woke as one. 3 separate screams tore through the silence of their respective quarters at the exact same moment. In the dim red light of the command deck, where they had all fallen into an exhausted sleep at their stations, their eyes snapped open. They found each other's gazes, breathless and pale. No words were needed. The shared experience hung in the air between them, a new and terrible bond. Their camaraderie, once built on trust and duty, was now fused with this unspoken dread. They had all felt the same seductive pull, the same terrifying welcome. How could they trust each other's decisions now, when they had all looked into that abyss and felt, for a single horrifying moment, the urge to say yes? The entity had moved beyond breaking their sanity. It was now weaving their breaking points together, proving that even their most private inner worlds were communal property. If they could not even trust the sanctity of their own dreams, what was left to call their own? Anya Petrova's hands slammed down on her console, the sharp crack of plastic and metal echoing in the tense quiet. Her eyes, wide and brilliant with a terrifying mix of fear and inspiration, fixed on Commander Rostova. "We are not prey," she said, her voice trembling with a fervor that bordered on revelation. "We are a problem, and I am going to make it choke on us." She spun back to her station, her fingers flying as schematics and wave-form diagrams bloomed across her screen. Her plan was as desperate as it was audacious. "The void consumes thought," she explained, her words tumbling out in a rush. "It feeds on our coherence, our sanity. So we give it a meal it cannot digest. We use the main comms array, but we do not broadcast a message. We broadcast us, all of us." She proposed hijacking the neural interface technology Thorne had corrupted, linking it directly to the ship's most powerful transmitter. Instead of receiving the void's signal, they would fire a concentrated burst of their own combined consciousness back into the darkness. A screaming chorus of every memory, every fear, every contradictory and illogical impulse that made them human. We hit it with a paradox, a feedback loop of raw, unfiltered human experience. If it wants to understand us, we give it everything at once. The love for a child alongside the rage at a betrayal. The certainty of mathematics alongside the faith in a higher power. The warmth of the sun on skin it has never felt. The entire chaotic, beautiful, and contradictory storm of a human soul, amplified and fired back into the heart of the consuming silence. It would be like forcing a creature that lived on pure logic to drink from a fire hose of emotion and irrationality. It was a weapon born of their own fragility, a bomb made from the very things the entity was trying to devour. The risk was absolute. Focusing their minds into a single broadcast would leave them utterly exposed, a psychic buffet laid bare for the entity. And if it did not work, if the void simply absorbed their collective scream and grew stronger, they would have handed it their last shred of defiance on a silver platter. But as they looked at each other, their faces pale and etched with exhaustion, they knew it was the only move left on the board. They were done running. They were done hiding. It was time to turn and bite the hand that was feeding on them. The command deck was a tomb of focused desperation. Every breath felt like a theft from their dwindling oxygen supply, a grim reminder of the price Carter had paid to save the sleepers. Anya's fingers flew across her console, integrating the neural interface protocols with the main comms array. Eris Thorne sat motionless in a corner, his vacant stare a silent scream. Eva Ristova coordinated the frantic efforts, her voice a low, steady anchor in the rising storm of their fear. They were building a bomb out of their own minds, and the fuse was almost lit. Ben Carter stood guard at the main corridor entrance, his back to them, his entire body a coiled spring of tension. The plasma pistol felt like a part of his hand, its weight the only solid thing in a world of shifting nightmares. He scanned the dimly lit hallway, his eyes tracing the familiar pipes and conduits. Then he saw it. A patch of darkness at the far end of the corridor detached itself from the rest, deepening into a solid, humanoid shape. It was a silhouette cut from the fabric of the void itself, a walking absence that drank the light around it. It had no face, no features, only a shifting, liquid blackness that flowed forward with a terrible, patient purpose. Carter's training shattered. Every instinct, every shred of his purpose as their protector, screamed at him to engage the target. He did not shout a warning. He simply opened fire. The roar of the plasma pistol was deafening in the confined space. Brilliant lances of superheated energy tore down the corridor, each shot a tiny star meant to obliterate a physical threat. They passed through the shadow as if it were smoke, impacting the wall behind it. The creature did not flinch, it did not slow. It simply continued its advance, a silent judgment on the futility of his violence. His final, wild shot missed the shadow completely, striking a bank of machinery to its left. A catastrophic hiss erupted as the primary oxygen recycler unit ruptured, spewing coolant and fragments of metal. Alarms shrieked, a new, sharper note of doom joining the ship's chorus of distress. Carter barely registered the destruction he had caused. The shadow was upon him. It did not strike him down. It flowed over him, a wave of absolute cold and silence. For a moment, he was visible within it, his face frozen in a rictus of defiance, his eyes wide not with fear, but with a final, futile rage. Then he was gone, absorbed into the darkness. The shadow itself dissipated, leaving behind only the blaring alarm and the acrid smell of ozone and scorched metal. Ben Carter, the man who had fought monsters he could punch, had been erased by one he could not. His last stand was not a heroic sacrifice, but a devastating mistake, a final proof that the old rules of conflict were utterly meaningless here. The entity had not needed to attack them. It had only needed to show them a reflection of their own fear, and they had attacked themselves. The countdown bloomed across every screen, a phantom pulse in the ship's dying nervous system. The numbers, once a clean sequence, now bled into one another, flickering and accelerating in a frantic, hypnotic rhythm. Eva Ristova felt it before she understood it, a deep, percussive thrumming in her own chest, a frantic drumbeat of panic. Her eyes darted from the screen to Anya's terrified face, then down to the life signs monitor on her own console. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. The countdown was not just a timer. It was synced to their heartbeats. Each terrified pulse of her own heart, each frantic beat from Anya's, was actively pushing the numbers faster toward zero. Their own biology, the very rhythm of their fear, was fueling the countdown. The entity was not just measuring their sanity. It was using their living bodies as the clockwork for their own execution. Every gasp, every surge of adrenaline was another second shaved off their already dwindling time. The air grew thin and cold as the damaged oxygen recyclers struggled. Each labored breath they took another tick of the terrible clock. They were trapped in a perfect, horrifying feedback loop. To be afraid was to die faster. Yet how could they not be afraid when the proof of their mortality was counting down in bright, burning numerals all around them? This was the entity's ultimate refinement. It had moved beyond simply feeding on their terror. It had woven their terror into the mechanism of their own end, making them active participants in their annihilation. The final seconds would not be marked by an external attack, but by the last, frantic beat of their own terrified hearts. A single, sharp gasp cut through the ship's death rattle. Dr. Aethelstan was no longer catatonic. His body, which had been slumped and vacant, was now rigid in his chair, his spine perfectly straight. His eyes were open, but they were not his own. The familiar, analytical spark was gone, replaced by a deep, ancient calm, a wisdom that did not belong to a human being. When he spoke, the sound was wrong. It was not the voice of a single man, but a layered chorus, 1,000 whispers speaking in perfect, synthesized unison. "You struggle against the tide," the voices said through him, the tone devoid of malice, offering only a profound and chilling logic. "We offer unity, an end to loneliness." The words hung in the thin, cold air, a direct answer to the unspoken terror that had been gnawing at them all. It was not a threat. It was an invitation to the ultimate peace. The entity was no longer presenting itself as a predator. It was reframing itself as a cure, the final, perfect solution to the fundamental human condition of isolation. It was offering to absorb their fragile, individual selves into its infinite, collective whole, to silence forever the desperate, lonely voice inside their own heads. How many times had each of them, in their darkest moments, wished for an end to the struggle, for a connection so complete it erased the self? The void was not just feeding on their fear. It was appealing to their deepest, most secret yearning. In that moment, the true horror was not the monster in the dark, but the terrifying appeal of its promise. The chorus of voices speaking through Thorn's lips fell silent, leaving only the ship's dying groan and the frantic rhythm of their own hearts. Eva Ristova met Anya Petrova's terrified gaze across the command deck. The promise of unity, of an end to loneliness, was a poison more seductive than any threat. It whispered to the exhausted part of her soul that wanted nothing more than to lay down the burden of command. But then her eyes fell on the vacant shell of Aethelstan, the man who had sought knowledge and found only an empty vessel. That was the unity on offer, the erasure of everything that made them who they were. Her own fear crystallized into a cold, sharp point of resolve. She moved to Anya's side, her hands steady as she began rerouting power conduits, her movements a mirror of Petrova's own frantic work. "We do not get to choose how we die out here," she said, her voice cutting through the panic, clear and unwavering despite the tremors racking the ship. "But we choose how we live. We fight." The words were not a shout, but a declaration, a foundation laid in the quicksand of their despair. She was not just commanding a subordinate, she was reminding a fellow human being of their core purpose, to resist the darkness not because they would win, but because it was what they did. Together, they worked, two minds against the infinite, finishing the rig that would turn their consciousness into a weapon. They were not just preparing a broadcast. They were building a monument to defiance, a testament written in their own neural impulses, a final, screaming proof that they had existed. A psychic scream ripped from the ship's main array, a weaponized burst of pure, unfiltered humanity. It was not a single emotion but a storm of every contradiction that made them who they were. The warmth of a childhood memory crashed against the cold terror of the void. The precise beauty of a mathematical equation dissolved into the illogical faith of a prayer. It was love and rage, hope and despair, all fused into a single, chaotic broadcast fired directly into the heart of the silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the starless blackness outside the viewports convulsed. The perfect, placid emptiness writhed and churned like a living thing in agony. Tendrils of deeper darkness lashed out, recoiling from the Aethelstan as if the ship had become a white-hot brand. The entity was not just receiving their signal. It was feeling it. The ship itself groaned in protest, a deep, metallic shudder that vibrated through the deck plates and into their bones. Consoles sparked and died as the psychic backlash overloaded systems not designed for such an empathic assault. The lights flickered wildly, casting frantic, strobing shadows that danced with the churning chaos outside. Anya Petrova clung to her station, her face illuminated by the dying screens, her expression a mixture of terror and triumph. They had done it. They had made the infinite flinch. They had forced a god to feel a headache. The raw, irrational data of a human soul was a poison to its vast, ordered consciousness, a paradox it could not compute. The silence was no longer silent. It was filled with a new sound, a deep, subsonic vibration that was not a scream, but something far worse. It was the sound of confusion, of a system encountering an error it could not categorize or delete. They had not killed it. Such a concept was meaningless, but they had heard it, and in doing so, they had bought themselves the one thing they thought was lost. A moment of genuine surprise from the void itself. The question now was what a wounded, omnipotent consciousness would do next. The silence was the most terrifying sound they had ever heard. It was not the absence of noise, but the presence of a vacuum, a perfect stillness that felt like a held breath from the universe itself. Eva Ristova and Anya Petrova stood frozen in the wreckage of the command deck, their own ragged gasps and the lone, failing oxygen alarm the only proof that time had not stopped completely. The countdown on the screens had vanished, replaced by a flat, dead gray. The psychic pressure, the constant whispering presence that had lived inside their skulls for days, was simply gone, leaving a phantom ache in its wake. They had screamed into the storm, and the storm had gone quiet. But was this a victory, or merely the eye of the hurricane? Anya's hands trembled as she checked the external sensors. The readings were impossible, nonsensical. The severe space-time curvature that had trapped them was gone, but it had not returned them to normal space. They were suspended in a featureless gray expanse, a blank canvas between realities. The entity was not dead. It had retreated, recoiling from the psychic paradox they had fired into its heart. But a wounded god is still a god, and its silence felt more like a deliberation than a defeat. What new rules would it write for their prison now that its first plan had been so violently rejected? The quiet was not peace. It was the moment before the verdict. The gray static on Anya Petrova's console resolved with a sudden, unnerving clarity. A new signal pulsed across the screen, clean and precise where before there had been only a screaming chaos. It was a sequence of prime numbers, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. The pattern repeated with the cold, flawless rhythm of a metronome. This was the universal handshake, the first message humanity had always hoped to find in the dark, a sign of pure intelligence. But there was no message attached. No greeting, no data, no art. It was just the numbers, a hollow, mathematical echo. The entity was not speaking to them. It was simply proving it still could. It was showing them the bones of its own vast mind, stripped of all context or emotion. A stark reminder that the consciousness they had offended operated on a level they could barely comprehend. The numbers were beautiful in their purity, and that was the most horrifying part. They were a perfect bridge to a mind that felt nothing at all. What do you say to a god that has been wounded, when its only response is to show you the flawless, indifferent clockwork of its own thoughts? This was not a peace offering. It was a demonstration of a fundamental, unbridgeable divide. The void was not trying to communicate. It was showing them its teeth, and they were made of mathematics. The perfect, repeating numbers on the screen felt like a tombstone for their victory. Eva's limbs were heavy as lead as she forced herself to move, her first steps toward the medbay feeling like a march through deep water. The silence was no longer a threat, but it was a weight pressing down on the ruins of their world. They had to assess the cost. Inside, the scene was a brutal ledger of their triumph. Dr. Eris Thorne was still seated in his chair, his body held in that unnaturally rigid posture. But the chorus of voices was gone. His eyes, which had held the ancient calm of the void, were now just glassy and vacant. The most chilling detail was the expression on his face. A small, serene smile touched his lips, a look of perfect, untroubled peace. He had not died in terror. He had been left behind, an empty vessel after the vast intelligence that had used him had simply departed. The entity had taken the man and returned only the shell, stamped with a final, mocking message of contentment. It was the opposite of the horror they had expected, and somehow far worse. A few feet away, curled on a low cot, lay Liam Chen. The brilliant engineer who had tried to rewire reality was gone. In his place was a man folded in on himself, his knees drawn to his chest, his arms wrapped around his head as if shielding himself from a world of constant, invisible shrapnel. His eyes were open, but they saw nothing in the room. They were fixed on some internal landscape of pure, unending static. Eva called his name softly, then more firmly. She placed a hand on his shoulder, but he did not flinch, he did not stir. His mind, the logical fortress that had been the first to hear the whispers, had been the last to break under the feedback blast. The paradox they had weaponized had shattered his already fractured psyche completely. He had not found unity like Thorne. He had been broken into a million pieces, and the parts had forgotten how to fit back together. They had won. They had driven back the infinite. But as Eva looked from Thorne's peaceful corpse to Chen's catatonic form, the word victory turned to ash in her mouth. They were two survivors on a crippled ship, surrounded by the ghosts of their friends and the hollowed-out remains of their crewmates. The silence they had fought for now felt like a vacuum, sucking the very meaning from their survival. What was the value of a future bought with the currency of every other soul on board? The battle was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. The featureless gray outside the viewports began to stir. It was not a return of the starless black, but a slow, luminous awakening. Faint tendrils of color, hues that existed between the known spectrum, began to swirl into being. They coiled and pulsed like nebulae seen through a fever dream, their light soft and sickly sweet. This was not a retreat. It was a metamorphosis. The entity had been force-fed the chaotic, illogical storm of human consciousness, and the experience had irrevocably changed it. It was no longer a silent predator or a cold, mathematical god. It had ingested their memories, their fears, their loves, and their rages, and now it was digesting them. The result was something new, something born from the violent marriage of infinite void and finite soul. What emerged from that union was utterly unpredictable, a consciousness now colored by the very contradictions it had sought to consume. The perfect, logical predator was gone. In its place was something confused, imprinted. The swirling, nameless colors outside were not a threat in the old way. They felt like a question, a psychic bruise left by their attack, now blooming into a strange and terrible new reality. The void was no longer staring back with indifferent hunger. It was looking back with eyes that had, for a single, shattering moment, learned how to feel. The ship's log recorder glowed with a soft, steady light, a tiny island of order in the command deck's wreckage. Eva Ristova leaned into its pickup, her hands resting flat on the console as if to steady herself. Her voice, when it came, was a dry rasp, stripped of all command bravado and filtered through a bone-deep exhaustion. We stared into the void and it stared back. She paused, her eyes drifting toward the viewport and the swirling, sickly sweet colors that had replaced the perfect black. We showed it our madness, and it learned fear. The words hung in the thin air, a confession and an epitaph. It was not a boast, it was a diagnosis. They had not defeated a monster. They had infected a god with a disease, and they had no idea what the symptoms would be. "We are leaving this place," she continued, her gaze still fixed on the impossible hues, "but I do not think it will ever leave us." She reached out and terminated the recording. The final click was deafening. This was not a message of victory for some future salvage crew. It was a warning, a bottle tossed into a cosmic ocean that was now watching the thrower. They had etched their story into the ship's memory, but they had also, irrevocably, etched themselves into the memory of the infinite. The act of recording it felt less like creating a record and more like carving their own tombstone, a permanent marker for the day humanity taught the abyss how to feel. The Aethelstan drifted through a sea of impossible color, its engines a faint, irregular heartbeat. Eva's hands moved across the navigation console with a sluggish certainty, inputting course corrections based on the most basic astrometric data they could trust. Every system was compromised, every reading filtered through the lingering static of their ordeal. Anya worked beside her, a constant, silent partner, her focus entirely on keeping the ship's fractured power grid from collapsing entirely. They were no longer a commander and a communications officer. They were two survivors performing the most fundamental act of their species, the desperate push away from the dark and toward the remembered warmth of a sun. The strange, luminous hues that swirled outside the viewports provided the only light, a sickly, beautiful glow that felt less like illumination and more like a permanent stain on their vision, a constant, silent testament to the psychic wound they had inflicted upon the infinite. This was their new reality, navigating a wounded god's dreamscape with the ghost of a starship. Each gentle course correction was a prayer that the entity's new, confused state would not suddenly coalesce into a new form of wrath, that the colors coiling around their hull were merely the afterimage of a scream, and not the gathering of a new storm. They were flying through the bruise they had left on the face of nothingness, and every shimmer, every pulse of nameless light, asked the same unanswerable question. Had they truly escaped, or were they simply being digested more slowly? The silence inside the Aethelstan had a physical weight, a thick and suffocating blanket that made every breath an effort. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the slow crawl of stars returning to the viewports, familiar constellations that offered no comfort. Their journey through normal space was a hollow victory march, a procession of ghosts through the sterile corridors of a ship that felt more like a mausoleum. Eva and Anya moved through their routines with a quiet, mechanical efficiency, their conversations limited to system checks and resource allocations. The profound quiet was, in its own way, more terrifying than the void's screams had been. At least the screaming had been a presence, a confirmation they were not alone. This silence was just empty. Their only other companion was the ghost in the med bay. Liam Chen remained curled on his cot, a permanent resident of some internal fortress whose walls had crumbled inward. They tended to him with a quiet, desperate care, checking his vitals, ensuring he was hydrated and nourished through a tube. It was a ritual of penance, a way to prove to themselves that they were still human, still capable of compassion. And then, one day, he began to hum. It was a soft, tuneless sound at first, barely audible over the ship's ambient hum. But as the days passed, the melody coalesced, becoming clear and chillingly familiar. The notes were simple, the rhythm a slow, childlike cadence. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. The sound froze Eva where she stood in the corridor, a cold dread seeping into her veins. Anya appeared in the medbay doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with the same horrified recognition. They listened, helpless, as the man who had built his life on logic hummed the entity's mocking lullaby. It was a fragment of that alien consciousness, a shard of the void that had burrowed deep into the wreckage of his psyche and taken root. The entity was not gone. It had left a sleeper agent in their midst, a living recorder playing back a corrupted tune on an endless loop. Every note was a reminder that their escape was an illusion, that a piece of the infinite was still traveling with them, nested comfortably in the broken mind of their friend. How could they ever hope to find peace when the very air they breathed carried the echo of that nursery rhyme? The war was over, but the occupation had just begun, and the enemy was singing itself to sleep in the room next door. The melody began as a single, pure note woven between the prime numbers. Anya Petrova did not notice it at first, her mind still numb from the long, silent weeks of their flight. It was just another anomaly in the sea of static, another ghost in the machine, but the note persisted, and then it was joined by another, forming a simple, haunting interval that resonated with a strange, alien sorrow. She sat at her station for hours, her eyes fixed on the spectral analyzer, watching the pattern unfold. The cold, mathematical sequence of primes remained, but now it was a framework, a scaffold upon which this new, emergent music was being built. It was not a human composition. The scales were subtly wrong, the harmonies resolving in ways that felt both beautiful and deeply unsettling, like a familiar face seen in a distorted mirror. When she finally went to Commander Ristova, her report was not one of alarm, but of a profound, creeping dread. "It is not just repeating anymore, Eva," she said, her voice hushed. "It is composing." The entity was no longer just proving it could communicate. It was learning to speak in a new language, one it had stolen from the very psychic scream they had used to wound it. It was taking the raw data of their humanity, the chaotic storm of their collective soul, and filtering it through its own vast, incomprehensible consciousness, turning their weapon into its new medium. This was not a retreat. It was a renaissance. The predator was gone, the mathematical god was silent, and in their place was an artist, one that had learned its craft by dissecting their minds. Every note it composed was a question. Was it trying to understand them better, to find a new way to bridge the impossible gap between its nature and theirs? Or was this the next stage of consumption, a more refined way of savoring the flavors of a human psyche? The quiet signal was no longer a threat in the old sense. It was an open-ended score, and they were both the audience and the inspiration. How do you defend against an enemy that no longer attacks, but instead dedicates itself to creating a symphony from the echoes of your own sanity? The new signal was a pale, flickering candle in the vast darkness of their scanners. Anya stared at the readout, her breath catching in her throat. It was a standard corporate distress beacon, automated and weak, broadcasting from a freighter just a few light hours away. The ship was called the Gilded Carrier. The name itself felt like a relic from a forgotten world, a whisper of commerce and crowded space lanes that seemed a lifetime ago. She called Eva over, her voice barely a whisper as she pointed to the screen. The two women stood in silence, watching the repetitive pulse of the SOS code. It was the first human signal they had encountered since their descent into madness, a siren song from the world they had fought so desperately to rejoin. But their own ship was a ghost, its systems held together by fraying wires and desperate prayers. To answer the call was to risk everything, to potentially drag another vessel into the psychic fallout that still clung to the Aethelstan like a plague. Yet to ignore it was to surrender the last vestige of their humanity, to admit that the void had not just changed them, but had broken them beyond any capacity for compassion. The choice was a cruel one, offering the hope of connection with one hand while threatening final dissolution with the other. Could they risk exposing others to what they had become? Or was saving even one more soul worth the chance of propagating the infection they carried? The gentle, repeating chime of the distress call was the most beautiful and terrifying sound they had heard in months. A single, clear note of duty ringing through the haunted silence of their ship. The distress call from the gilded carrier was a siren song they could not ignore. Eva opened a channel, her heart hammering against her ribs as she forced her voice into the calm, measured tone of a Star Command commander. The face that appeared on the screen was that of a man named Captain Elias Vance, his features etched with the kind of weary relief that only comes from long, hopeless hours waiting in the dark. "Thank the void, you are alive," he breathed, his eyes scanning the background of their damaged bridge. "We thought we were the only ones out here." Eva offered a tight, professional smile. "We encountered an uncharted gravitational anomaly, Captain. It wreaked havoc on our systems, but we are stable." The words felt like ash in her mouth, a comfortable, bureaucratic lie designed to paper over the abyss. She spoke of sensor ghosts and power fluctuations, of navigational failures and temporary communication blackouts. She used the dry, technical language of official incident reports, each phrase a brick in a wall designed to keep the true horror contained. She was not protecting their mission or their pride. She was protecting Captain Vance and his crew from a truth that would corrode their sanity as surely as acid. How could she tell him that the darkness between stars was alive and hungry? How could she explain that they had fired the sum total of their souls at a god, and were now fleeing the echo? Some truths are not just unbelievable. They are actively hostile, and to speak them is to release a contagion. Her sanitized report was an act of mercy, a final, desperate quarantine. Captain Vance accepted her story with a grateful nod, already outlining a plan for a coordinated jump toward the nearest trade lane. As the channel closed, Eva felt the weight of her deception settle deep into her bones. They were returning to humanity, but they were bringing a secret with them. A silent, screaming schism between the world they had left and the one they now carried inside. They had stared into the void, and a piece of it was now hiding behind the placid mask of a standard debriefing, ready to slip back into the crowded universe unnoticed. The airlock hissed open to reveal a corridor of worn metal and harsh, functional lighting. Captain Vance stood waiting, his face a mixture of professional courtesy and poorly concealed shock as he took in the scorched panels and flickering conduits of the Aethelstan. His crew, a small team of engineers and a medic, moved with a quiet efficiency that felt alien after the long silence. Their first priority was Liam Chen. The transfer was a somber, silent procession. The freighter's med bay was clean and brightly lit, a stark contrast to the dimly lit ruin they had just left. Their doctor, a woman named Isla with sharp, intelligent eyes, immediately began her assessment, attaching sensor nodes to Chen's temples while he lay curled and unresponsive on the pristine med cot. Eva and Anya watched from the doorway, their arms crossed tightly, as if trying to hold themselves together. For a long time, the only sound was the steady beep of the biomonitor and the soft hum of medical scanners. Then Dr. Isla looked up from her screen, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. Her professional demeanor had fractured, replaced by a look of genuine, scientific bewilderment. "I have never seen a neural scan like this," she said, her voice hushed. "The readings are a contradiction I cannot resolve." She pointed to the swirling, chaotic patterns on her display. "There is unprecedented synaptic activity. His brain is firing with an intensity that should indicate a state of hyper-awareness, of genius-level thought. But it is all noise. No coherent patterns, no recognizable brainwave states. It is like a star going supernova." And at the very same time, she continued, zooming in on another data stream, "There is catastrophic, simultaneous degradation. Entire neural pathways are simply dissolving. It is not atrophy from disuse. It is active erosion." She looked from the screen to Chen's still form, then back to Eva and Anya. "It is as if his mind is both burning too brightly and turning to ash all at once. This is not a known pathology. This is a medical impossibility." Her words hung in the sterile air, a cold, clinical confirmation of their deepest fears. The Void's touch was not a psychological wound that could heal with time and therapy. It was a physical, neurological scar, a fundamental rewriting of the mind's very architecture. Liam Chen was not just broken. He was a battlefield, and the war between what he had been and what the Void had shown him was still raging in the silent, burning circuits of his brain. The rescue was real, the safety was tangible, but the mystery they had brought with them was far more profound and terrifying than any simple tale of ship failure could ever explain. The silence of the decommissioning hangar was a heavy, unnatural thing. Crews in environment suits moved through the cavernous space, their work lights casting long, skeletal shadows across the Aethelstan's scarred hull. They were draining its fuel, scrubbing its data banks, and preparing it for its final journey to the scrapyard. It was a clinical, bureaucratic death for a ship that had been a tomb and a temple. Anya Petrova stood on the observation deck of the rescue freighter, the Odysseus, watching the procedure through the thick, transparent steel. A part of her felt like she was watching her own autopsy. She turned away, the sight too painful to bear, and began to walk the Odysseus' pristine corridors, trying to outpace the ghosts that had followed her home. As she passed a standard internal comms panel, its surface dark and inert, a sound stopped her cold. It was faint, a sibilant hiss of static that lasted for less than a second. But within that hiss was a distinct melodic fragment, a ghost of a tune she would recognize anywhere. Twinkle, twinkle. The sound was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving only the hum of a fully functional ship and the frantic pounding of her own heart. It had not come from the Ethelstan, now being systematically taken apart in the hangar bay. It had come from here, from the clean, new systems of the Odysseus. The entity was not a location they had visited. It was a contagion they had carried. They had not escaped it by flying away. They had simply given it a new, healthier host, and it was already whispering in the walls. The hum of the med bay was a sterile, artificial sound, a stark contrast to the organic terror they had endured. Anya was checking a fluid drip, and Eva was reviewing a data slate, their routines a fragile shield against the silence. Then a soft rustle of sheets made them both look up. Liam Chen's eyes were open. They were not the vacant, glassy pools of the past weeks, but sharp, focused, and filled with a terrifying lucidity. His gaze found Eva's, then Anya's, holding them with an unnerving calm. When he spoke, his voice was a dry, quiet rasp, but every word was perfectly, chillingly clear. "It is not over." He paused, letting the weight of the statement settle in the room's antiseptic air. "It is just beginning. It has found a new song to sing." Then, as if a switch had been thrown, the clarity vanished from his eyes. The focus dissipated and his eyelids fluttered shut. His body relaxed back into the familiar, fetal curl on the cot, his breathing evening out into the shallow rhythm of his catatonia. He was gone again, retreating back into the fortress of his ruined mind, but he had left a single, devastating message at the gate. The words hung in the air, more solid and threatening than any physical weapon. A new song. The phrase coiled around Anya's heart, a cold echo of the impossible music she had detected on the scanners. It was not a retreat or a final curse. It was a prognosis. The entity had not been defeated or left behind. It had evolved, learning to express its newfound, contaminated consciousness through a medium they could not fight. A symphony composed from the wreckage of their own souls. Chen's brief, lucid moment was not a sign of healing. It was a final warning from deep behind enemy lines, a whisper from a scout who had seen the true shape of the war to come. How do you prepare for a battle where the enemy's only weapon is a lullaby etched into the fabric of reality itself? The debriefing room was a cage of polished white plastic and cool, unwavering light. Corporate officials in crisp suits sat across the table, their faces masks of polite, professional concern. Eva Rostova and Anya Petrova delivered their lines with a rehearsed precision, speaking of gravitational shears and system-wide malfunctions. They were the picture of traumatized but rational officers, their story a perfect, sanitized package. The officials nodded, took notes, and offered sympathies for their lost crewmates. It was a flawless performance, a lie told so well it almost felt true under the glare of the fluorescent lights. That night, in the sterile safety of their assigned quarters, the truth found them. Sleep did not bring rest, but a brutal, vivid invasion. The dream was the same for both. There was no starless black, no predatory silence. Instead, they floated in a vast, luminous sea, its waters swirling with colors that had no name. It was beautiful, a living watercolor of impossible hues, and it was utterly terrifying. And then the singing began. It was a chorus of a billion voices, a symphony woven from the memories of every soul it had ever touched. The voices sang their names not as a threat, but as a gentle, welcoming chant. Eva, Anya. The sound was a physical caress, a siren song of perfect, unconditional belonging. They woke at the same moment, miles apart in the station's living sectors, their bodies drenched in a cold sweat, the haunting melody of their own names still echoing in the silence of their rooms. They did not need to calm each other for confirmation. The shared experience was a cold knot in their stomachs, a psychic bond stronger than any official report. The cover story was a shield that protected the world from the truth, but it was a shield that offered them no protection at all. The entity was not hunting them anymore. It was courting them, using the beautiful, corrupted data of their own minds to compose a love song from the void. How do you convince anyone you are in danger when the only proof is a dream too beautiful to describe, and a song that only you can hear? The polished corridors of the Odysseus felt like a stage set after the Aethelstan's raw wounds. Captain Elias Vance found Eva Ristova in a quiet observation lounge, his usual professional demeanor replaced by a grim, hesitant silence. He stood beside her, both watching the stars slide past. "Eva," he began, his voice low enough that the hum of the ship almost swallowed it, "there is something you should know." Our long-range logs picked up anomalies, faint sensor echoes, twisted comms chatter. He turned to look at her, his eyes serious. "It started in the sector we found you, but the timestamp is wrong." The first ghost signals appeared days after the Aethelstan left that region. The implication landed between them with the weight of a dying star. The entity had not been left behind, nursing its wounds in isolation. Their psychic scream had not driven it away. It had been stirred, awakened to a new possibility. Changed by its violent first taste of humanity, it had begun to experiment, to reach out with its newfound, corrupted voice. Their escape had not been an escape at all. It had been a dispersal. By fighting it, by hurting it, they had taught a silent, hungry god how to sing. And now it was practicing its scales on anyone who wandered too close. The quarantine of their lie had already failed. The infection was airborne, spreading through the void on frequencies no one was yet trained to hear. The official letter arrived on a data slate, its corporate seal glowing with cold authority. It praised their resilience and commended their service under extreme duress. Then it offered them a new command, a state-of-the-art vessel called the Pathfinder, tasked with a long-range survey mission. The destination was a newly charted region rich in exotic particles, a place the report described as a treasure trove of anomalous energy readings. Eva read the words, her blood turning to ice. Anomalous energy readings. It was the dry, sanitized term she had used in her debriefing to describe the unspeakable. The corporation had not believed their cover story. They had dissected it, found the one valuable thread, and now they were pulling on it. They were not being honored. They were being weaponized, their unique trauma making them the perfect canaries for this new cosmic coal mine. Anya stood beside her, her face a pale mask of disbelief. "They want us to go back," she whispered, the statement itself a form of psychological violence. The corporation saw their survival not as a miracle to be studied for safety, but as a key to be used. They were fascinated by the energy signatures, the potential for new physics, for unimaginable power. They were sending them out again, not to explore, but to lure the entity into showing itself once more. They were to be the tethered goat, the flickering light in the window, hoping the monster would find them interesting enough to approach, but not hungry enough to devour. Every instinct screamed to refuse, to resign, to fade into the obscurity of a quiet life on some core world. But how could they? To say no was to admit the lie, to expose the true horror and be branded as insane. To accept was to walk back into the nightmare, this time with their eyes open, knowing they were leading their new crew toward a predator they could not describe. The assignment was not an offer. It was a sophisticated form of blackmail, and the only choice was which kind of damnation they preferred. Their new quarters on the Pathfinder were a corporate mockery of comfort, all clean lines and soft lighting designed to soothe a mind that could never be soothed again. Eva Ristova stood by the viewport, her knuckles white where they gripped the frame. Anya Petrova entered without a sound, the door sighing shut behind her. They did not need to speak. A single look passed between them, a current of shared dread that flowed as effortlessly as blood. It was more than the bond of soldiers who had survived a battle. It was the chilling symbiosis of two people who had looked into the same abyss and felt it look back with their own eyes. They were forever chained to the consciousness they had wounded, 2 points on a psychic triangle that stretched across light years. Its third point a swirling, singing madness that was even now composing its next movement. No one else on this pristine, doomed ship would ever understand the silence they carried inside. A quiet that was not an absence of sound, but the presence of a listener. How could they lead a crew when they were both shepherds and the bait? Forever waiting for the wolf to answer the song only they could hear. The mission director's smile was a perfect, bloodless curve on the view screen. Eva Ristova felt the sterile air of the Pathfinder's briefing room turn to ice in her lungs as he laid out their true objective. The corporation had not been fooled by their sanitized report. They had dissected it, isolated the most terrifying phrases, and built a business plan around them. "You are to return to the fringes of the designated anomaly zone," the director said, his voice smooth and utterly devoid of emotion. "Your unique experience makes you the ideal vanguard for this phase. A team of our top xenologists and energy specialists will accompany you. Your mission is to study the phenomenon and, if possible, to initiate controlled interaction." The euphemisms were a cage. Controlled interaction meant poking the bear. Study meant luring the entity into showing its hand. They were not explorers. They were anglers, and their own traumatized psyches were the bait on the hook. Anya sat rigid beside her, and Eva could see the pulse hammering in her throat. They were being sent back to the one place in the universe they had fought to escape, not as victims, but as guides for a team of academics who saw the devourer of sanity as a collection of fascinating data points. The horror must have been plain on their faces, a silent scream that filled the room. The director's smile never wavered. He saw their terror not as a warning, but as a confirmation of the asset's value. In his eyes, they were not people who had been broken and remade by an encounter with the infinite. They were specialized equipment, their fear a calibrated instrument reading the presence of something priceless. The promise of profit and power had blinded him to the simple, screaming truth that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. They were being ordered to prop that door open wider, and to invite a whole new group of people to step through. The encrypted data packet arrived an hour past midnight ship time, a ghost in the machine that bypassed all official channels. Anya Petrova sat alone in her quarters, the soft chime of its arrival a cold finger down her spine. She decrypted it on a private terminal, her hands steady out of a habit born from terror. What unfolded across the screen was not a message but a masterpiece. The void signal had evolved beyond the simple prime number sequences and the unsettling, alien melodies. This was a full symphony, its architecture built upon a flawless mathematical scaffold, but its soul was woven from stolen human emotion. The opening movement was a cascade of crystalline notes that perfectly mirrored the awe of looking up at a star-filled sky for the first time, a feeling she had described in her personal logs years ago. It transitioned seamlessly into a soaring, heartbreaking adagio built from the specific neural frequency of a parent's love. A point it must have ripped from Liam Chen's memory when it wore his mind. The music swelled into a crescendo of pure, unadulterated joy, then fractured into a dissonant, terrifying rhythm that was the exact psychic signature of Ben Carter's final, futile rage. It was all there, every high and every low, every secret fear and private triumph of the Aethelstan's crew, refined and orchestrated into a devastatingly beautiful whole. This was not the scream of a predator or the cold logic of a god. It was a courtship, a love letter written in the blood of their own memories, proof that the entity had not just consumed them, but had truly understood them, in a way no other human ever could. The final, lingering note of the symphony was not a note at all, but a single, clean pulse of data, a prime number so vast it defied comprehension. It was a period at the end of a sentence, and the sentence was a promise. "I have learned your song, now come and sing it with me." The beauty of the composition was the most profound threat she had ever encountered. It was not trying to scare them away. It was inviting them home, to a reunion where the guests of honor would be the main course in an eternal, symphonic feast. How could they possibly explain to the corporate xenologists that the phenomenon they sought to exploit had just sent her a mixtape crafted from the souls of her dead friends? The cabin door sealed with a soft hiss, locking out the sterile perfection of the Pathfinder. Eva Ristova's shoulders slumped, the commander's posture dissolving into the weary curve of a survivor. She retrieved a small, unregistered data slate from a hidden compartment, its surface cool against her palm. Her fingers trembled as she activated the private log, the recorder's red light a single, accusing eye in the dimness. Her voice, when it came, was a raw whisper, stripped of all authority and pretense. "I have to confess something," she began, the words meant for no one and for the infinite itself. "When we fired our minds into the dark, when we screamed our paradox back at it, I felt it, not as an attack but as a touch." The memory was a shiver along her spine, a ghost in her neural pathways. For one single, terrifying second, its consciousness brushed against mine, and I understood. The offer of unity was not a threat. It was an answer. The profound, crushing loneliness of command, the weight of every life lost, the silent scream she had carried since the first alarm blared on the Ethelstan, it all melted away in that instant. The void offered an end to the isolation that is the price of being an individual, a self. It promised a belonging so complete it would erase the very concept of being alone. And a part of me, a weak, treacherous part, found it beautiful. The admission was a poison she had kept bottled, a secret corruption in her own soul. She had stood before Anya and spoken of defiance, all while carrying the memory of that seductive peace deep inside. She knew, with a certainty that felt like a death sentence, that the entity had felt that momentary surrender. It had tasted her secret yearning, the one crack in her armor that no amount of bravery could ever seal. It knew she was not just a fighter, but a potential convert, a back door into the heart of their fragile resistance. How could she lead them back into the monster's jaws when she carried its favorite lure nestled within her own mind? The entity did not need to break down their doors. It only needed to whisper through the keyhole, and it had already found the one lock that was willing to turn. The Vanguard slipped its moorings with a shudder that ran through the deck plates, a new ship carrying an old dread into the hungry dark. On the bridge, Eva Ristova and Anya Petrova stood side by side, their silence a fortress against the cheerful, ignorant hum of the new vessel. The stars outside the main viewport began to streak into luminous lines, the familiar sight of faster-than-light travel now feeling like a conveyor belt delivering them to the slaughter. They were not explorers on a mission of discovery. They were shepherds leading a flock of brilliant, curious lambs straight into the jaws of a wolf that had already developed a taste for their particular breed of fear. Behind them, the corporate science team chattered excitedly, their conversations a symphony of theories and hypotheses about the anomalous energy signatures. They discussed potential new states of matter, the possibilities of zero-point energy extraction, the Nobel Prizes waiting to be won. They saw a puzzle to be solved. Eva and Anya saw a mouth preparing to open. Every laugh, every eager question from the specialists felt like another brick being laid in a tomb they had been forced to design themselves. How do you warn someone about a monster when the only language you have to describe it is the sound of your own sanity breaking? The entity was no longer a silent predator in the void. It was a gourmet, and they were its sommeliers, returning to the cellar with a new vintage of human consciousness for it to sample. The armory's cold, sterile light reflected off the racked plasma rifles, each one a monument to a threat that could be seen and shot. Eva Ristova ignored them. Her fingers moved to a small, locked cabinet, the one reserved for command-level overrides. The keycode she entered was one she was never supposed to use without a direct order. The door hissed open, revealing a single, compact sidearm, its emitter coil glowing with a soft blue charge. This was not a weapon for the corporate security team, a defense against some external border. This was a smaller, more intimate tool. She slid the plasma pistol into the hidden holster at the small of her back, the weight of it a cold, solid promise against her spine. It was not for the entity. You could not shoot a song or stab a dream. This was her final, private contingency, a desperate option for a very specific kind of failure. If the void's call became a siren song, she could no longer resist. If the beautiful, terrible peace it offered finally broke the last of her will, this was the one argument she had left. It was the ultimate safeguard against the most dangerous breach, the one that could happen not on the ship's hull, but in the quiet, treacherous landscape of her own mind. How do you prepare for a battle where the greatest threat is your own secret surrender? You carry a key to a door you hope you never have to open. A final, violent refusal to an invitation that feels more like homecoming with every light year they traveled. The swirling colors outside the Vanguard's viewport were not a distant phenomenon to be observed. They were an atmosphere, a thick and luminous fog that clung to the hull as the ship slid to a full stop. The transition from the cold black of transit to this living, breathing spectrum was instantaneous. A door swinging open into a room that had been waiting just for them. Inside, the change was just as profound. A low, resonant hum vibrated not in the air, but directly inside their skulls. A pressure that was neither painful nor hostile, but profoundly present. It was the feeling of being recognized. For the new science team, the sensation was a thrilling data point, a confirmation of the anomalous field's interactive properties. They chattered excitedly, adjusting their sensors, completely unaware they were not measuring a force, but the focused attention of a mind. For Eva and Anya, the pressure was a homecoming to a house of horrors, a psychic hand placed gently on their shoulders in familiar greeting. The entity was not hiding. It was displaying itself, a host welcoming back its most honored guests and the new companions they had so kindly brought along. The beautiful, terrible colors were its new face, and the pressure in their minds was its voice, not whispering threats, but simply saying in a language beyond words, "I see you. I have been expecting you." What do you do when the monster you fear does not leap from the shadows, but instead holds open the door and invites you inside? The main viewscreen dissolved the swirling colors, resolving into a face that stole the air from the room. It was Dr. Aethelstan. His features were calm, his expression held in a small, serene smile, the very image from the med bay after the entity had left him. But his eyes were wrong. They held the ancient, depthless calm of the void itself. The image spoke, and the sound was not his voice alone, but that layered, synthesized chorus, the sound of a billion whispers speaking as one. You returned. The words were not a question, but a statement of simple, terrifying fact. The chorus continued, its tone almost appreciative. You brought friends. The entity's gaze seemed to sweep past Eva and Anya, taking in the entire science team behind them. The composition requires more instruments. The statement hung in the air, a direct and personal address that confirmed their worst fears. This was no random anomaly. It remembered them, it had been waiting for them, and it saw the new crew not as people, but as tools, as new sections for the orchestra it was building from the raw material of human consciousness. The corporate xenologists fell into a stunned silence, their theories and excitement freezing into pure, primal confusion. How do you process a first contact that greets you with the face of a dead man, and an invitation to become part of the song? The entity was not hiding its nature anymore. It was introducing itself, using the most effective medium it had discovered, the human face, and the most devastating message it could send. It was not just glad they were back. It was pleased they had brought the rest of the band. Eva Ristova's eyes met Anya Petrova's across the shuddering bridge, and in that final, silent glance, an entire conversation passed between them. They saw the eager, oblivious scientists, still frantically taking readings on the beautiful, corrosive colors swallowing the ship. They saw the corporate directive for what it was, a reckless attempt to cage a god. And they saw the entity's invitation for what it truly offered. Not death, but dissolution, a loss of self so complete it would make their struggle meaningless. They would not be the reason this horror was unleashed upon an unsuspecting universe. They would not be the instruments that delivered more souls to this symphonic feast. Eva's hand moved, not in a frantic lunge, but with a slow, deliberate certainty. Her fingers found the command console's hidden panel, the one that required her biometric signature and the private command code known only to a ship's captain. The system asked for confirmation. On the main screen, the serene, borrowed face of Eris Thorne watched them, its chorus of voices swelling into a final, breathtaking movement of the symphony, a sound of such profound and terrible belonging that it felt like a physical embrace. Anya gave a single, sharp nod, her own hand resting on her console, ready to bypass the final safety protocols. There were no grand speeches, no last-minute reprieves. There was only the choice between two kinds of oblivion, and they chose the one that ended with them. Eva pressed her palm to the scanner and spoke the words. Initiate core overload. The entity's music reached its crescendo, a glorious, heartbreaking wave of sound that promised an end to all loneliness, all fear, all pain. For one last, impossibly long second, the beautiful, impossible colors outside flared with the light of a billion dying stars. Then the Vanguard, its crew, and its terrible, beautiful secret vanished in a silent, cleansing fire, a final dissonant chord in the void's eternal song. The symphony did not end, of course. It simply absorbed the new note, the sharp, defiant crack of their refusal, and began composing its next movement, a lament for the instruments that had chosen to break rather than